Hi everyone, so I am back with another video, and in this video we are going to discuss the output based questions of exception handling. So I have already discussed all the key points related to exception handling in the previous video. So if you haven't watched that video yet, I would suggest you to go back and watch that video first. So yeah, let's start. So this is our very first problem. Let's see what's there in the code. So we have a main function and we have one more function, right? So main function has a string which is equals to null, right? That means we have a string which is null, right? And there is a statement which is making a call to this function by passing this null string to it. So basically this main function is calling to this function by passing null string to it, right? So now we have string is equals to null for this function, right? So inside this function we have a variable length which is of integer type, and it is assigned a value as 0. So we have this try catch block, try catch and finally block. Now let's see how and what it is doing. So we have this character ch, which is basically what we are doing, string which is null dot char at 0. So we are trying to access 0th index in a null string. Is it possible? Is it really possible to access 0th index in a null string? No, right? That means it will throw a null pointer exception. It will throw a null pointer exception, right? So as soon as we'll get this null pointer exception, the control will go to this catch block. The control will go to this catch block. Now what is there inside this catch block? What is there inside this catch block? So catch block says initially we had length which was 0. Catch block says increase the length by 1. That means length is now 1, right? And it is also saying then return this length, right? So now this 1 will get back to this function call, right? That means this function call is holding a return value as 1. Still the execution of this function is not completed, because if you remember in the previous video we discussed the third point, that finally block has to be executed no matter what. So it really doesn't matter if there is a return statement and the value has already been returned, right? It will be executed. That means the value it is holding is 1, and for this function also the length value has been updated to 1, right? Initially the value was 0. From here we come across this null pointer exception and the control moved to this catch block. Now this catch block has incremented this value by 1. So from 0 to 1, and then this value is returned to this function. But since the execution of this function is not completed yet, the value is not printed. Value is not printed and the control moves to this finally block. Now we have length as 1. And the control has been moved to finally block. So finally block says increment the length by 5. So now we'll increment the length by 5, which becomes 6. Now length has become 6. And finally block also says that return this length. So now the final value 6 will get returned. So earlier it was 1, now it has become 6. Now it has become 6. That means now the execution of this function has been completed. Try has done its work, catch has done its work, and finally is also completed. So now the final result that comes from this function call is 6. That means our answer will be 6 in this case. I hope you understood how these try, catch and finally blocks are working, right? There was an exception which has to be handled, so it went to this catch block. Now catch block is returning something. So it will get returned, but when the value is returned, the execution is not completed, because we discussed in the previous video that finally block has to be executed whether, no matter what. That means if there is a return statement in the catch block, still the execution of finally block has to be done. So it holds the value as 1 until the execution of finally block is completed. That means the length will become 6, 1 plus 5 will be 6, and then the 6 will get returned and the value printed will be 6. So our output for this code snippet will be 6. Explanation is very simple. Value is updated to 1 in the catch block, then 5 is added to it by making it 6 in the finally block, and hence the value is also returned by finally block, because there is a return statement inside the finally block which is 6. Right? I hope it makes sense. So yes, let's move to the next problem. So if you will see the code, you will find it very similar to the previous one, but there is a little difference. What is the difference? The difference is, in the previous problem, the return statement was inside finally block, and in this problem, the return statement is outside finally block. Right? So please take a minute and try to solve this problem on your own, and then we'll discuss its solution. Okay, so let's start. So again, there is a main function which is calling this function func by passing null to it, right? There is a length variable which is initialized to 0. Again, we are trying to calculate null dot something. So that means this line will throw null pointer exception which has to be handled. So the control will go to this catch block. Now what catch block is doing? We have length which is equals to 0. Now catch block says increment the length by 1 and return this value. That means the call which was made, that is main to func. Right? Now this function will hold 1 as a return value. But since there is a finally block, it is not get printed, because the value will get printed only after the whole execution of this function is completed, right? That means it will wait for this finally block to be executed. Now it says, okay, there are two things now. First one is this length variable which is inside the function, and second value is this one which is returned by the catch block, right? Now what finally block says? After try and catch, the control goes to finally block. Now finally block is saying that increment the length by 5. That means the value will get incremented and it will become 6. Right? Now, is there any other statement inside finally block? No, there is no other statement inside finally block. That means the execution of finally block has been done, and now the value, that means after execution of the finally block, the value has already been returned. The function has been returned already, but the finally block has to be executed. So it waited for finally block, but finally block says just increment the local variable of this function by 5. So it made it to 6 by adding 5 to it, right? But the value returned to this function is still 1. That means in this case the value returned in this case will be 1 only, and hence the value printed will be 1 only. So the output in this case will be 1 only, right? So basically, let me summarize it for you. We passed null as a string, right? We had this length is equals to 0. We tried to access something from the null string, so it throws null pointer exception, right? And when the exception is thrown, the control moves to this catch block. Now this catch block says increment this length increment this length by 1, right, and return it. That means it returned 1. It returned 1. Now this function, this function is holding 1 as an output from the function call, as a result of the function call. But still the execution of function is not completed, so the control will move towards finally block. Now finally block says increment the length by 5. So it incremented the length by 6, right? But is there any return statement in the finally block? No. Right? That means only 1 which was returned earlier will be the result from this function call. So the output for the above code is 1, and I have already explained why it is coming out to be 1. Okay, so this is the third problem. Again we have a code snippet. We have try, finally and catch block, right? So okay, let's go through it. So try block has some print statement A, then it says it throw an exception, so it will throw an exception. Now there is a finally block and there is a catch block that catch this exception E, right? So this is the code structure. If you haven't gone through the previous video, I am repeatedly saying it again and again, that please go through the previous video, because all the concepts we are using in this video have been discussed in the previous video, right? So if you have already watched the previous video, you will know that there should be an order between among try, catch and finally block, which is TCF. That means try comes first, then catch, followed by finally. This is the order we have to follow, or the code must follow, right? That, and if we'll see in the code, there is catch, then finally, there is try, then finally, and then catch. That means this is not the correct order and it will throw an error. That means according to our knowledge, the answer should be compilation error for this case, because these 3 blocks are not following the correct order. So the output for this problem will be compilation error. Now let's move to the to the fourth problem. Okay, so let's see. We have a try and catch block. So we have two exceptions that have been thrown from this try block. First one is null pointer exception and second one is arithmetic exception. So for your knowledge, exception class is a parent class for both null pointer exception and for arithmetic exception, right? So this exception class is the parent class for both null pointer and arithmetic exception. So when we entered the try block, there is a null pointer exception that has been thrown. That means it has to be cached. So the control will go to the catch block and it will handle the exception, right? But what is this next statement? Will it be ever reachable? No, it won't be reachable, because every time the null pointer exception is thrown, the control will move to the catch block. It will never get executed, right? So that means if it is again the case of unreachability, it will again throw a compilation error. So the answer for this code snippet will be C, which is compilation error, right? So the statement throw new arithmetic exception is unreachable, and hence the answer will be compilation error to this problem. Now let's discuss this problem. So we have try block, we have catch block, and we have finally block, right? So try says throw arithmetic exception. Done. It says throw arithmetic exception. Now it will give the control to this catch to catch the arithmetic exception. Since this is a parent class of arithmetic exception, will go inside this catch block. Now this catch block says print catch. Okay, catch is printed. Now it says throw null pointer exception. Okay, if you remember in the previous video, okay, catch has already been printed. So let me write the catch. If you remember in my previous video, I said that the exception has to be handled once. The exception has to be handled once for a try block. That doesn't mean that for every exception thrown it has to be cached. If you will see in this code snippet, there is a try block which throws arithmetic exception, and there is a catch block which handles this exception. But again, this catch block throws null pointer exception, but there is no catch block to handle this null pointer exception, right? So that means there will be a null pointer exception. Now, since there is a finally block, we will move, the control will move to the finally block and finally will get printed, right? So till now we have catch and we have finally as an output. Now it again says throw null pointer exception, but again there is no handling for this it's number format exception. So again there is no handling for this number format exception, right? So now the output on the screen will be catch and finally, which will get printed, but also an exception will be thrown, which is number format exception. Remember, whenever there are two or more exceptions which are unhandled, so the last unhandled exception will be thrown by the program. If we'll see, there is null pointer exception and there is number format exception. If there is null pointer exception and there is number format exception, but this is also unhandled, but the last unhandled exception was number format exception. So the output will be catch and finally, but the exception thrown will be output will be catch and finally, but the exception thrown will be number format exception. I hope it makes sense. So if there are two or more unhandled exception in a program, the last unhandled exception will be thrown, right? Now let's see. Let's say somehow I managed to catch this exception. Let's say I modified the code something like this, that inside the finally block, let me write it for you. Okay, let's say finally block has also try and catch block, which is where try block is throwing a number format exception and there is a corresponding catch block which is handling this number format exception, right? What I said if there are more than two exceptions in a program which are not unhandled, the last unhandled exception will be thrown. So in this case, if this is the case, this number format exception is already been handled. That means the last unhandled exception will be null pointer exception in this case, right? So the output will be same, catch and finally, but the exception thrown will be different, which is null pointer exception in this case. And if finally block is similar to this, the exception thrown will be number format exception, right? I hope it is clear to everyone. Okay, so the output is catch and finally, which will get printed on the screen, right? But the exception thrown in this case will be number format exception, because this is the last unhandled exception in a code. Now let's move to the next problem. Okay, so we have a try block which is throwing arithmetic exception. We have catch block. Okay, all right, it is similar to the previous code. The second version we discussed, I wrote the code there, but it is very similar to that. That means in this question also, the exception, this last number format exception is being handled by this catch block, but the last unhandled exception is null pointer exception in this case. So the exception thrown will be null pointer exception, right? But the output will be same as the previous one, which is catch and finally. Output will be same, but the exception thrown will be different. In case someone is asking you what exception will be thrown by this program, so the last unhandled, which is null pointer exception, will be thrown by this code. Yes, so the output is same, catch and finally will get printed. This is our next problem. Let's discuss what the code says. Code has a try block, and code has a catch block, and code has two finally block corresponding to one try block. Is it possible? Again, we have discussed this concept in the previous video, that this is not possible. That means again it will throw an error, which is compile error. So the answer for this code snippet will be compile error. Please go through the previous video to know, have more clarity on the concepts. This is not allowed in exception handling, hence the answer will be compile error. So yes, this is our answer, compile error. Okay, so now we have two classes. First class is a parent class and second class is a child class, right? Okay, so there is no parent-child relationship between the classes. Their names are just parent and child, right? So parent has this main function, which is creating the object of this child class, and with the help of the object of child class, it is calling this method. Very simple. Now what it is doing? So inside method, they have initialized an array of length 1 having first value as 1, right? So let me write it. We have main function. Now main called this method, right? Now method says I have an array ARR which has one element and that element is 1, right? Now let's come to this try block. Try block says print 4th index of an array, the element at 4th index, but the length of an array is 1. That means we are trying to access an element which is beyond the length of array. So it will throw array index out of bound exception and the control will move to catch block. Now catch says return ARR 0. That means what it is saying? What is ARR 0? It will go to ARR 0, the value is 1 and the value will get returned. Now we'll see if the method execution has been completed. Is there any finally block? Yes, there is a finally block, and finally block says update ARR 0 by 2. So that means ARR 0 will get updated to 3. It will get updated to 3. And now the execution of this function has been completed. But is there any effect on this returned value? No, because we returned the value, right? So the value will be 1 and this 1 will get printed. So the correct option will be A, which is 1 as a value. Okay, so now let's discuss another variation of the same problem we discussed before, right? So again we have an array inside this method. So procedure is same. Main function called method, and inside method we have an array which is holding 1, right? Which is holding 1. And let's say this array is stored at 100 address. That's the address will be, base address of an array will be 100. Okay, so again it says that print the element at 4th index, which is not possible. Array index out of bounds exception. The control will move to the catch block. Now catch block says return the address. That means this main, the address will get returned. That means this main will hold 100. This main will hold 100, right? But is the execution completed? No, execution is not completed yet, right? There is a finally block. So what finally block says? Finally block says update the value at 0th index by 2. So it will go to 0th index, it will update its value by 2, which is 3. right? Is the execution completed? Yes, finally block has been completed. That means execution of this method has been completed. Now this child dot method is holding 100 because it is a return value which has been returned by the method. And now it says print the 0th value of 100. So 100 is the base address of the array and the value which is there on that address is 3. So that means in this case the value returned or printed will be 3. Right? In the previous case we were dealing with the value. It just returned 0th index value. So it is so the returned value was 1 and the function call was holding that 1 only until the finally block is completed. But in this case it has returned the address, so it is holding 100, and then in the finally block we are updating the value at address 100. So after execution of the finally block, when we try to access 100th address 100, there is a new value which is 3 and it is updated by finally block. So in this case the returned value will be 3. Explanation is very simple. Initially ARR 0 was 1 and then 2 was added to the same address by the finally block to make it 3, right? So return value is 3 in this case. So let's discuss this problem. So now again we have try block, we have catch block, we have 3 catch blocks, right? We have try block and we have multiple catch block. So this is the case we have this is the case for which we have one try block, and for that try block we have multiple catch block. Okay, so this try block says throw new number format exception. Okay, so whenever there is an exception thrown by the try block, the control will go towards the nearest catch which catches exception. Now this exception is a parent class for all the exception: number format exception, arithmetic exception, null pointer exception. That means whatever exception will be thrown by this try block will be handled by this catch block. So we have discussed this concept again in the previous video. Just pause the video. If you haven't watched that video yet, pause the video, go through that previous video and come back to this. The answer for this problem will be compile time error. Yes, so D is the correct option. Okay, so this is for you guys to try. This is basically a homework problem in which we have a try block and we have multiple catch blocks, right? So I would suggest please try to solve this problem and let me know the answer of this problem in the comment section, right? So yeah, just try this problem and let me know the answer. That's it for today's video. I hope you liked the video and understood each and every problem we discussed. So yeah, let's meet in the another video. Thank you.